care to remember Cale Crowley. Ladies and gentlemen of the association, I think you made a mistake this morning. I should have made the introduction and Cale should have given the speech. But now you know why I like to come home to the big sky country. See people like Cale and Joe Meglin, Ben Hefner, and others. I feel that I'm back once again among people with whom I've been raised, who I understand, and who I think understand me a little bit. To get away from the hubbub, the confusion, the chaos, and the forests which comprise Washington and the world, and to come back to this blessed bit of America, where you can still raise a family in freedom, still hunt and fish, enjoy the mountains and the high plains, still enjoy a little solitude, and look up and see the stars at night, and the sky in all its glory in the daytime. Montana is unique. Montana is fortunate. And those of us who have the privilege of living in this state and, incidentally, this region are blessed indeed. But getting down to the situations of today, we are confronted in 1967 with a challenge whose character is peculiarly of our own times, even if it has been of many times in the making. We are living through a long night of violence both at home and abroad. A harsh antiphony of hostility is heard throughout this nation. It rises out of the ordeal of Vietnam and is echoed in the turbulence of the nation's cities. The sound of violence does not sit well with me or with you who are trained to seek peaceful and orderly solutions to disputes. Nevertheless, as a nation, we have become so jaded by the continuous violence of our times that the sense of indignation appears dulled except at moments of fierce fury when a great city goes up in flames. It takes a Detroit to rouse a nation, but Detroit took a toll of 43 dead and brought injury to more than 1,000 people, many of whom were peaceful bystanders. For 5 days, the overall casualties in Detroit ran at a higher rate than those which of late have been suffered by American forces in Vietnam.
What Senator Mansfield failed to acknowledge in this speech is the fact that in 1967, the chaos of the U.S. war in Vietnam was also echoing in Montana. This program is a video snapshot of how the U.S. war in Vietnam was and continues to be a visible part of everyday Missoula life. In Part 1, we meet Professors West and Levine of the Mansfield Center, who teach the Vietnam War as history and culture at the University of Montana.
And so at the moment it's a combination of both war and Vietnam as a people.
As a scholar of Asia, Vietnam, of course, is a country whose history and culture are much broader than the war. And so there's a kind of shifting back and forth between those two themes when I think about Vietnam.
In Part 2, we hear from U of M students as they respond to questions about the war in Vietnam and the current local controversy concerning the fate of the peace sign on Waterworks Hill.
I've heard certain groups saying, well, it's a broken cross, and other people saying that it stands for peace, and another one saying it's commemorating the veterans. And so there's all these different symbols that people have put on this one sign.
In Part 3, we meet Tate Jones, director of the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History, and learn about the role that the Vietnam War era plays in the Missoula Museum.
Oh, just a favorite. This is one of my favorite life covers from the period. This is, I think this is a very much a dated photograph that I think might come as a surprise to people who grew up during the Reagan years.
In part 4, we meet Greg Burham and Charlie Brown as they introduce us to the history of the Montana Vietnam Veterans Memorial that was dedicated in Missoula in November 1988, and the current issues that continue to face Vietnam veterans in the Missoula area.
When people think about Vietnam veterans, they think stereotypically about homeless veterans, and they don't think about senators and doctors and lawyers and counselors and social workers. And
Montanans have always served in greater numbers than most, and among those populations, Indians have served in even greater populations out of Montana, and so have females.
In part 5, we hear from Bao Ninh, North Vietnamese infantry veteran and writer, who was part of the Vietnam-American dialogue that took place in Missoula at the Mansfield Center in June of 1998.
Và sau đến năm 1969, khi tôi tốt nghiệp trung học là lớp 10 của hệ thống học đó, thì tôi gia nhập quân ngũ.
In 1969, after I graduated from high school in Vietnam, which is the 10th grade, I joined the Army.
In association with Missoula Community Access Television, the students of the University of Montana present this video snapshot of the U.S. war in Vietnam as history and culture in Missoula, Montana.
What do you think is the purpose of a memorial?
Well, when I hear the word memorial, I think of memory. And to come back to our course and to the Vietnam War, we have very powerful memories, very powerful legacies. And but those memories are very complex and they're very contested. And so the first memory I have is, as a student, it was to oppose the war, which I thought was wrong. But then the memory has become significantly enriched through the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is a different kind of memory that, yes, it could still be wrong, but there's a human dimension to it that softens the urge to say that it's just wrong. And then, of course, now I like memorial, as objects that we look at and they stimulate us to think in certain ways. But for me, memorial, even literature is a kind of memorial, or artwork can be a memorial. And as you know, Josh, in our class, reading literature, reading Vietnamese literature is a kind of a memorial, and that's a very different kind of memory.
I think as historians, which we both are, memorials are almost like aids, memory aids in a way, and I think they're interpreted in different ways. A good memorial is something that has more than one meaning, and that people who have different perspectives on an event or a series of events, which a war is, can get something out of a memorial that will both instruct them as well as remind them where they've been. And I think as a people, Americans tend to be rather ahistorical. We tend to shove the past into the memory hole. So memorials are ways of preventing that from happening.
What do you think is the not the trade-off, but just the interplay between something for the dead and something for the living?
Well, I like your question. As you know, not only was I opposed to the war when I was young, but that also I was a conscientious objector. And in that cultural framework, actually, I tended to dismiss soldiers. It's not that I disliked them, I just wouldn't even include them in my thinking. And that has changed in my life. And now I have come to appreciate the soldiers, of course, soldiers, both American soldiers and Vietnamese soldiers, and the importance of combat, the drama of combat, the impact of combat on human memory. And so, you know, I've told you that I like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. I also like the one here in Missoula. Of course, it's a very different memorial. And what's interesting to me is that the memorial here in town is a very soft memorial. Actually, it's very compassionate. It's even more compassionate, you know, in its message, I think, than the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. But it's a compassion that's pretty specifically defined, I think. And what intrigues me, and I've been there several times on Veterans Day, you know, with the veterans, and I've been to meetings here on campus, you know, where we've talked about the Vietnam War. And those meetings will often attract people, you know, who will focus on the dead and the heroic qualities of the American soldier. And I have come to respect that later in life, you know, as I not did before. But I do that without losing some of my earlier feelings about the war, about soldiers, about combat, and then most of all about the impact of war on all human beings, you know, whichever side they may be on.
When I see war memorials, it usually reminds me that war is not a game. Sometimes our society, particularly young people, think of war as a game, as an excitement of violence. We are a very violent people historically. And yet the men and women who were memorialized in these places were good people who died, and often in circumstances which were unnecessary. Certainly the Vietnam War, I still think, was a mistaken war, an unnecessary war. And I think that we can remind ourselves of the cost of war and also the mistakes that are made by our leaders very often. Because as an historian looking back at the events of the 1950s through the 1970s, what continues to strike me is what struck me at the time, and that is that people in responsible positions of leadership in Washington made one series of tragic errors after another, even though there were people who knew better and who warned them against that.
All right. I think right now, on that note of the leaders of the time, we're going to listen to the first address that I selected from Mike Mansfield.
For 5 days, the overall casualties in Detroit ran at a higher rate than those which of late have been suffered by American forces in Vietnam.
Well, I guess my first response at Montana and the country were really lucky to have a Mike Mansfield in the Senate.
As you know, here at the Mansfield Center, we're inspired by this man. This speech was given 33 years ago, so I like the historical context of it. His voice is so strong and compelling, isn't it? His thinking is profound. His leadership at that time was also very much appreciated. Probably not recognized as fully in 1967 for his role as Senate Majority Leader in trying to bring the war to an end as it was later on.
To that, I'd like to engage the substance of what Senator Mansfield said, and that is that much as we may abhor violence in our own history at critical points, the birth of our nation, the Civil War, violence is a part of politics. It's not the part that should be normal, but I think at great wrenching moments in our history, as well as the histories of other countries, including Vietnam, violence is part of revolutionary wars. One again may prefer them not to be there, but it's a historical reality. And I think if we simply reject that without understanding the role that violence can play, then you will have an inadequate understanding, and you'll also not be able to produce good policy.
When you enter into the discussion of violence, it provokes reflection, you know, for each of us in terms of our own cultural context and our own personal context. But we also realize that violence is part of a much broader human context, and that violence, actually we're relatively nonviolent as a country right now. There's not much violence. There is plenty, and there's more than we would like. But compared to many other parts of the world, you know, violence is not as big a problem here as it is elsewhere.
What, if any, do you believe is the connection between war, violence, and human nature?
As long as we have history, there have been wars. Human beings are violent creatures, and one of the ways their violence is expressed is through warfare. And that, the understanding of how wars are generated is a very complicated phenomenon. There are economic, political, all kinds of different causes, but I think there's something intrinsic in the nature of human beings that produces violent behavior, and war is a kind of organized violence for political purposes. Those political purposes are often not set by any kind of democratic fashion. It could be small elites who are pursuing an agenda which a country may have imposed upon them more than they actually choose. But it seems to me that what we need to do as human beings, not just as Americans, is to think of ways of minimizing those tendencies for this violence to be expressed in warfare.
I like your question about human nature, but I don't have a very good answer. I'm just frustrated by it because it's very personal, because I used to think that war and violence are not the result or not the outcome of something within human nature, but that they were basically the results of people who had power and were misusing their power. I used to think also when I was younger that if people like myself, in my own sort of personal arrogance, would become pacifists, that then there would be no more violence in the world. I don't think that anymore because of the human nature dimensions of your question, because I think that war is an extension of the human condition, and I think violence springs from the dark side of the human soul. So your question only provokes thought. At the moment, I don't have any clear answers.
All right. Well, I think that we'll go ahead and listen to the other Mansfield address right now and have a couple more quick questions.
Certainly we should have learned from Korea before we became involved in Vietnam. And certainly we should learn from Vietnam what we didn't learn from Korea. Because Vietnam is more than a war in which we are involved in Southeast Asia. It is an issue and a question, as I've tried to point out previously, which is tied to practically everything happening in this country and in our relations with the other countries of the world, either directly or indirectly. So there is a need for change. I hope that those of us who raise our voices will be given the consideration which those who raise their voices against us should be given as well. It is my belief that instead of emotionalism and hate-mongering, which are becoming all too prevalent in this nation today, that we would, in the words of the President, freely paraphrased, lower our voices and do what we could to bring us together.
Well, I guess my initial response is the sadness that we don't have anyone like that in the Congress right now, or in a leadership position. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of wise people around. They never are. There weren't back 30 years ago. There are, I think, even fewer of them now. This is maybe just a reflection of an aging professor speaking. I think that the lesson that I would draw is that there are other ways of engaging issues than throwing around one's weight. And the beginning of that speech speaks to another senator's comment at that time, Senator William Fulbright, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who spoke very eloquently about the arrogance of power. And I think that the arrogance of American power is something that we still live with, to be sure. We have an important role in the world, but it's a role that cannot be filled unilaterally. When we tried to do that, essentially in Vietnam, we failed. And when we try to act in a multilateral fashion, we do a lot better.
We all try to learn from history, but not everybody agrees on what the lessons of history are. But what I like about this is the attempt to even to understand history, and even if we don't agree on the lessons, the attempt to extract lessons or to learn from our experiences of the past is, I think, is one of the most noble things that we can do. Mr. Fulbright also has used the phrase, makes a distinction between dominant and dominating. And he has talked about America as being the dominant power in the world, which indeed it is, militarily, economically, certainly in those two areas. But then he goes on to say that we are the dominant power, but we should not be the dominating power. What that means in terms of policy, I'm not quite sure, but I like the sound of it.
Right. But, what do you think the U.S. has learned or should learn from the war in Vietnam?
Well, one thing I think we've learned from Vietnam, maybe a good thing, is that through our mistakes and through our reflections and our own self-criticism, that I think perhaps we've softened some of the forces of the arrogance of power. But when you see that, then, and this counters or perhaps offsets what I just said, that the tragedy of war and the sorrow of war, is so deep and so tremendous. And you're left feeling numb, you're left feeling sad, you're left feeling quieted, and so that's a very disturbing feeling, but maybe that's also a good feeling. Maybe that's what it means to become educated and to become aware of other people.
Well, let me build on that a little bit. I think the first thing maybe I would say about the Vietnam War is that the American people lost their innocence during the war in a way that we really hadn't in World War I, World War II, or even the Korean War. And that is innocence, for example, directed towards Washington, the belief that our leaders always tell the truth, that they have wisdom, and that their decisions are always in the best interest of the American people. So I think that there was and I think that's healthy. I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think it's part of a democratic process, a kind of democratic maturation. It shouldn't go on to the exclusion of forgetting what the issues were at the time. I mean, I think that the people who fought the wars, the veterans who survived, as well as the men and women who died, have a very important part in my thinking about the war. But the people who were in power, who made mistakes, I don't forgive them. I don't forgive Robert McNamara. My view of Lyndon Johnson has not changed, although I know that his own thinking was more complex than it appeared to be at the time. But he was in a position of power, and he made tragic mistakes that cost the lives of millions of people. I will never forget that.
One more thing that brings it all back to the Missoula Valley, with all this healing and the symbols and the memorials and different things that how we come to terms with war and the Vietnam War specifically. Right now, up on the hill, there's the peace sign, which is actually just graffiti on a microwave deflector that recently got transferred from one company to another. And so there's this controversy here in Missoula that once again makes us remember that wars don't go away as long as we remember them or know about them. And especially the Vietnam War is very, whenever somebody says that, everybody has a response to it. They've been trained to think something that's uneasy.
What I like about the current controversy, and I think controversy is good, I think that's what we do in a democracy, is the argument that is being supported by those who want to keep the peace symbol there. The argument is it's a reminder that people who oppose the war are also patriotic, and that patriotism is not necessarily linked to people who are for war at any time in history. And that's what I like about it, and therefore it has certainly my support, to remind us of that.
I think that during the Vietnam War, the peace symbol was really a weapon in the hands of the anti-war movement, and it had an anti-military dimension. But peace, wars affect most of all people who are fighting them. Soldiers are the ones who die. On both sides. Civilians, of course, as well, in enormous numbers. And I think that the peace symbol should not be seen as an anti-military symbol. It's not directed against people in the armed forces. But it should be seen as a common symbol which people can rally around against war, not against the military. Because I think it is people in the military, above all, in responsible positions, who realize the gravity of fighting wars. So I think here symbols change over time, and I think that there's in this community as in other communities around the country, it's possible to reinterpret and to expand the meaning of something like this, which precisely because it's not an official memorial, because it is almost by happenstance, has a kind of potential power much greater even than something which is invested with official meaning. It's a people's symbol. It's not just a government symbol. And I think that we are American people. We're not the American government living here in Missoula.
I was wondering if you could answer a couple of questions about the Vietnam War.
I'd be glad to.
All right, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear or see the word Vietnam?
Loss of a generation.
Loss of a generation,
Or
interesting.
destruction of a generation.
All right, and can you think of one way in your childhood that you've been affected by the U.S. war in Vietnam, whether it's through people that you knew in the military or through TV, movies?
Yeah. My uncle was also my godfather, was in Nam, and came back pretty much an alcoholic and died in a car accident drunk, so that affected me pretty heavily as a kid.
And how does that affect you now?
It just really tunes me in, just especially when I, got through that age of, 18 to 22, and I was going to college and going to concerts, just to kind of reflect back on what those guys were doing. They were off killing people or being killed. It's just kind of a bizarre contrast. And also, I went to Vietnam traveling, and it was just bizarre. I was walking in with a backpack and long hair and a beard and, my sandals, and I was just trying to think those guys went in completely different circumstances.
Wow.
So,
That's cool.
yeah.
All right, and as far as now you live in Missoula, you consider yourself a Missoulian perhaps?
You bet.
Are you familiar with the current controversy about the peace sign on
I am.
Waterworks Hill?
I am.
What's your views on that?
I think, I don't know, there's a lot of aspects to the issue. I think the peace sign itself, the actual physical structure, is nothing to preserve necessarily. I think the idea is definitely worth preserving, and I read one Vietnam veteran had a good perspective on it. He said a lot of those guys in Vietnam were wearing peace symbols, because they weren't obviously enjoying the war. So I don't think it's necessarily offensive to veterans in and of itself.
What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear or see the word Vietnam?
I think of a war.
And can you think of any way in your childhood that Vietnam, the war, has affected you, either through books, TV, relatives?
I had an uncle who was actually very close to my mother, and he was missing in action, and so there was a lot of effort, including trips to Washington to try to unveil the MIA scenarios, and a few people from the family would try to get involved with the politics and the lobbying, so to speak, of trying to unveil that. So.
What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear or see the word Vietnam?
The first thing that comes to mind, I guess guilt,
All right. And can you think of any one way that you've been affected by the Vietnam War through your childhood and growing up, either through books, TV, relatives?
God, it's pretty pathetic, but mostly through TV, I guess. No, my parents definitely avoided the whole draft scene and everything, so they didn't have anything to do with it. I don't have any relatives directly affected. But I guess, just being affected by violence that's going on somewhere else in the world, that has been at the hands of the U.S. government, too.
Are you familiar with the peace sign on Waterworks Hill and the current controversy surrounding it?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm fully aware of the whole controversy, but I know it's being, that it might be taken down. Yeah, then why not keep it up there, I don't know, I'm kind of new to town, so it was, when I saw it, I just didn't know what it was for until I think The Independent ran something on it.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's cool. I think it's good that they leave it up there,
All right. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see or hear the word Vietnam?
I think about my dad, because he was over there, so.
That was my next question. What way in your childhood have you been affected by the war, either through relatives or TV or movies?
With the war in particular, growing up, occasionally, like my dad, he'd be asleep in his chair, and he'd have a dream or something, and he'd start talking in Thai. And that was a little weird. It was a little bit scary. But
What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear or see the word Vietnam?
My father.
Really? And so, could you follow up on that? And my second question is, in which way have you been affected by the war when you were growing up, either through relatives or TV or books?
Made my father a strong man and a proud man of making it through the war. And I don't know, made him the man he is today, I suppose.
And how do you feel that's affected you, like, up to this day?
Yeah, because that was one of the reasons why I joined the military, was so that I had some sort of sense of liberty and justice and freedom for all, that kind of thing.
So you're in the military? Or you were?
Yeah.
For how long?
5 years.
Are you familiar with the peace sign on Waterworks Hill and the current controversy surrounding it? And what do you think about that?
I don't know. I think it had its time and place, but I suppose if the people want to get together and buy that piece of property and keep the sign, it don't matter to me or not. But yeah, we should remember peace, that's for sure. There's no sense in going through another fiasco like Vietnam, you know.
Yeah.
All those young guys dying. But yeah, if you guys want to keep that thing, I guess.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
These are buildings that were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the late 1930s and were used by the National Guard as for various purposes up through the 1970s. And they agreed last year to let us take them over in exchange for keeping them up. So they will be the permanent home of what will be the most prominent regional military museum between Minneapolis and the West and Seattle for this area, certainly. Including a very large private collection worth about $2.5 million that the museum has loan privileges from.
And what aspect does the Vietnam War era play into the museum? Is it one of the, do you have big displays for it, or is there a focus?
Oh, we plan to. It'll be very prominent. We've done Vietnam programs in the past. We've had several local veterans give talks on their experience in Vietnam, including Charlie James, a retired Green Beret who now is a rancher and magazine publisher near Stevensville, and Wei Sim is a retired banker here who was a swift boat commander on the Mekong Delta. He's given a talk for us as well. And we've done several small displays on it, and since we have about 18,000 square feet to play around with in this building here, we plan to give it a very prominent position.
So,
Vietnam.
Have you found that with your display in your old building where you were, did you have quite a few Vietnam veterans coming through or interest in the Vietnam displays?
A fair number. Every couple of weeks we receive a new box of World War II material, uniforms, buttons, papers, and so forth. Vietnam veterans really aren't to that point yet. They're pretty much still mid-career people at this point, people in their 40s and 50s and so forth. So that stage of life really hasn't come about for them yet, but we've managed to acquire so far several very good items on Vietnam. One very good RB Aviation collection, for example, including flight helmets, North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese flags and so forth. So we've kind of touched the tip of the iceberg. We hope to be doing more and more of that and encourage veterans to consider us as kind of their place of trusteeship for the items that they brought back from Vietnam.
Do you expect that will play a fairly large role in the museum, in the new building, is to focus on all the local veterans?
Oh, very much so, especially if World War II is any guide. What frequent experience we've had is we put up an exhibit with some local items from local people in them, and their friends come out and see them and say that their items and say that's a good idea, and then they come back the next day with a box of their own material to give us. So it builds upon each other that way. Well, we've received a lot of local support, and now we'd like to turn that into regional support. The history of museums in Montana is they start out very modestly in pretty much all circumstances. For example, the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, which now has a world-class dinosaur fossil collection. Before they had their nice multi-million-dollar building down there, that started in the late 40s as a collection of 3 surplus Quonset huts on the edge of the Bozeman campus, right there. And the Montana Historical Society began earlier in the 1860s, essentially as a collection of books in the back of a newspaper office in Virginia City. So you get used to working on a very small basis where you're beginning in museums in Montana. However, once the idea catches fire and starts to receive local support, then all sorts of good things happen. And so we've had definitely modest beginnings with this museum, but as more and more veterans retire and have more time and money to devote to projects such as this, we believe we have received and we will continue to receive more and more support until we can make this museum very much a regional player in the field of military historical studies. And we've begun that, and we look forward to seeing it come to fruition over the coming years.
Great. So do you see the museum as a place of more just preserving facts and history, or also as a sort of memorial where people can come and visit and remember type of thing?
Oh, a combination. Until some years ago, museum theory was considered somewhat static, that your main purpose in putting together these institutions was to put together some bricks and mortar to have a secure place to display things, and that was pretty much the fulfillment of your mission. If museums want to compete today with the very large multitude of ways people can spend their spare time in America, they have to be a good deal more dynamic. You have to offer educational programs, you have to offer more in the way of audiovisual displays, and to an extent there's a memorial function too. This is part of a collection that Mike Halligan brought back with him. Mike Halligan is a state senator and lawyer here in town for many years, and in the late 60s he was an officer with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, also known as the Screaming Eagles. And he was assigned, I believe, in an advisory capacity to some South Vietnamese troops here. This one is Glenn Parmiter. Glenn Parmiter is a World War II Korea and Vietnam veteran, and he lives here in Missoula today. And he is currently Secretary-Treasurer of the Military Museum. This was taken in about 1968, I believe. This, I think, this is a very much a dated photograph that I think might come as a surprise to people who grew up during the Reagan years. And so this was part of their strategy to try to retain some recruits was to liberalize base regulations. You could drive around with a motorcycle helmet like that, or have a private motorcycle, and the interior. If you, the whole the magazine article, it shows soldiers being able to decorate their barracks room with psychedelic art, or pretty much do anything you wanted to. This was kind of an experimental thing they were doing at Fort Carson, Colorado.
Yeah, what do you think about this, actually? Peace sign controversy? What do you call it that?
I actually forget about it most of the time unless somebody brings my attention to it. I will point out, though, if you look at period photos of troops in Vietnam, lots of enlistees carry the peace sign on their rifle or on their helmet, or like you see right here. So I really find it hard to see how it's older veterans probably do have a problem with it. It just wasn't part of their generation. If they came in as if they were career people or came in from World War II or Korea, they really didn't see any point to that, probably wouldn't feel much identification with it. But I think a surprising amount of men who were privates and sergeants in the late 1960s probably would. So I think the whole thing is kind of an interesting aftershock of what happened on campus about 30 years ago. 30 years ago now. We had on the Oval, for example, people erecting mock cemeteries full of crosses of people who died in Vietnam right in front of Main Hall. The biggest thing, as I recall, was everybody went, a lot of people from campus went in and had a sit-down protest in front of the post office. I think it was in 1969 or 1970. Several hundred people on campus went over and sat down in front of the post office on the idea that if you irritated the U.S. Postal Service, that would somehow bring the end of the war in Vietnam. But I guess since that's where you have to go to register for the draft, I guess that's and I think the third big thing on campus here is I think somebody set the brochure rack on fire here at the ROTC building, which all pretty moderate stuff compared to what was going on elsewhere, of course, at the big Midwestern universities and Berkeley and so forth, but our little piece of it, I guess, if you like to think of it as such.
That's another thing that people don't understand about us, that we didn't volunteer, most of us. We were drafted. Right. And particularly in those smaller rural communities, like in Montana, they had a quota for every city. When you reached that quota, no one was safe. Like, I was carrying a 3.7 average in college when I was drafted my senior year. I was assigned to the first air cab, but I primarily worked with chest crackers, with thoracic surgeons. If you were hit between the throat and the stomach, I worked on you, basically, to give you a general area. And we had lots of those. Yeah. Well, what had happened was I worked on the National Memorial, and at that time, I was seeing more and more Vietnam veterans coming in, because with the advent of the National Memorial, there was a lot of interest again in Vietnam, and of course, good, bad, or indifferent, it evoked a lot of thought in everyone. And it brought a lot of pain and injury to the surface that people hadn't talked about in years. And so I was determined that when I got back to Montana, after we dedicated the National Memorial, that I was going to go out and find some people to work on a state memorial for Montana. There was a varied interest, and this went on for a couple of years, and finally in 1985, I just put an ad in the paper, and I called virtually everyone I knew that had anything to do with the war and said, you know, I want a doctor, I want a lawyer, I want an Indian chief, I want everyone on this committee. And literally, that's what we did.
Because we're all over the place. I mean, you're probably running into Vietnam veterans every day, all day, wherever you're, you know, moving around town. And we were taught pretty clearly when we came back that people didn't want to talk about it. People don't want to know about this. So we shut up about it. And we went about our lives, and again with varying degrees of success and failure and relationships and whatnot. We're very much a part of, I think, the communities and the states, and that I'm always kind of shocked that anybody cares about this, because it went for so long. Nobody asked, nobody wanted to know. Vietnam wasn't much a part of the national conversation for a long time.
What we're concentrating on, the project itself, is how the conflict in Vietnam affected Missoula, and now how, you know, in the past, the present, and the future is kind of what isn't that like the thesis? So that's what we meant by Missoula.
Well, there's a real interesting deal going on in Missoula right now. The peace sign on the hill. That's an example of the power of that. People start talking about the peace sign, and whatever your view is of it, there are some real strong opinions on both sides. You know, and within the veteran community, it's not like every veteran has this one take on it. Yeah. I mean, Roman has got some pretty. But yeah, people have some pretty strong, and I think that's indicative of the fact that Vietnam does still
very much exist.
Does still run through the culture and run through town.
I guess that's why I see this hypocrisy. If the objective is really peace, and you really want to bring this community together, and you know that sign is offensive to a great number in this population, why not create something that isn't? Virtually every time we saw that symbol, it spoke of hypocrisy. Because if you really believed in peace, why were you spitting on people? Why were you calling them names? Why were you throwing things at them? That symbol itself is, to me, a sign of total hypocrisy. If you really believe in peace, that was not the way to portray yourself.
But again, it speaks to the question you're asking too. I mean, that was one of the key symbols of the Vietnam War, and it still has for a lot of us that lived through it. Whatever has some real strength. I mean, people have strong feelings about that on both sides.
You know, Greg and I have talked about that. I don't think a lot of people understand about the Vietnam generation is, particularly among those that had served in Vietnam, not to talk about the war, because the acceptable practice was bury it and forget it. Because the vast majority of people in this country, that's exactly what they did.
So, as far as like the Montana Veterans Memorial, was part of it the concept that this would be a way for everybody, not only veterans, but for the whole community to approach that and open
those doors, open dialogue, start talking about things. Another statistic that the Veterans Administration really doesn't like to talk about is we have, as the poet says, 58,000 names on the wall and 3 times that many that died in the hall, as he put it. And basically what he was talking about were suicides. Since the Vietnam War, over 130,000 people have committed suicide. I think the other thing that Greg will tell you that we talked about extensively during the building of this memorial, we knew it was going to bring a lot of Vietnam veterans out of their shell, so to speak, and it did. In any event, we got it down to 2 final designs, and the committee was equally split on the 2 designs. And Deborah's was one of the 2 designs. And quite frankly, that afternoon it got very hot in the discussion about which concept would be accepted by us. And finally, Bob Whaley, who was a member of the committee, a retired Marine colonel, he had flown choppers in Vietnam, been shot down twice, then went back, became a fighter pilot, got shot down in a fighter. He raised his hand, he said, "Could I say something?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, keep in mind, this is in the midst of a rather heated discussion. And he said, "I like her work." And I said, and he pointed to Deborah's work, and I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I don't know who that upper figure is, but he pulled me out 3 times.
Wow.
And to say there was a lull that came over the group was an understatement. Then somebody said, "Let's vote," and it was unanimous. That's how we got Deborah's design. The story I love to tell is when we were raising money for the memorial, there were times that were really downbeat, and there were times that were very upbeat. But some of the things that kept us going were just perhaps per chance. But we had one little old lady in eastern Montana that about every time we really got down, she would send us $2 in her grandson's name, because that's all she could afford, because she was on a fixed Social Security income. But it just seemed that her letters and her $2 always hit when we needed it most. And most of the committee talks about her an awful lot. So that pretty well summed up what I feel. I guess if there's anything you could do with this film, it's to make sure that people do get in and see Greg, that people do get the medical services that they're entitled to. We have, as I said, so many Vietnam veterans that are still angry at the system, divorced from the system, until they're put in a position where they have no alternative whatsoever. They don't seek any governmental services whatsoever. And that's a real problem, even today, 30 years after.
And somewhere out there is the lady that designed this magnificent statue, Miss Deborah Copenhaver. There she is right there. veterans, families, and friends, please accept our tribute to your service and sacrifices in Vietnam. Although this may not be a mirror image of your experiences over there, it certainly triggers the processes that will cause healing and enable you to deal with your recollection of that era. The gentleness and compassion of the large figure and the dependence shown by the smaller figure, that, my friends, is what camaraderie is made of.
Today can be the suture that will draw together the wounds of spirit. And let us take time to resolve that never again will our veterans be asked to bear the brunt of an uncaring nation. Take back home with you the feelings evoked here and attach them to every Vietnam veteran you know and meet. Tell them that you care and that you give a damn what has occurred to them. The dignity bestowed on mankind in this monument is discernible for all. The dignity we bestow on each individual veteran will be displayed in our everyday acts. This symbol of our remembrance will mean different things to many of us. I hope and pray that to the Vietnam veteran, it will be the long overdue recognition of their valiant efforts that will finally take its place in our history. I will close with this simple thanks and welcome home to each and every Vietnam veteran.
We came home faceless, nameless, but somehow and in some way America in the past 15 years has come to grips with its conscience. It's as though this country has looked in the mirror and it didn't like what it saw. That process defies explanation. But Americans were finally able to comprehend and appreciate, at least in part, the sacrifices made by their own on behalf of a fellow man.
Tôi vào bộ đội và đi vào Nam, vào vùng Kon Tum.
I was sent to the south and I operated in the area of Kon Tum province.
Tôi chiến đấu ở sư đoàn 10 bộ binh.
I was part of the 10th Army Division.
Thì quân Mỹ, quân đối phương của chúng tôi, tức là lực lượng đối phương là sư đoàn 4 bộ binh Mỹ.
Our adversary was the U.S. 4th Division.
Và lữ đoàn không vận số 1.
And the 101st Cavalry Division.
Tôi chiến đấu ở Tây Nguyên trong 6 năm.
I fought in the Western Highland for 6 years.
Và kết thúc chiến tranh vào ngày 30 tháng 4 năm 75 ở sân bay Tân Sơn Nhất.
And we ended the war at Tân Sơn Nhất on April the 30th, 1975.
Trở về sau chiến tranh thì năm 76 là tôi sau khi kết thúc chiến tranh thì tôi làm trong thời gian độ khoảng gần 1 năm. Tôi làm nhiệm vụ tìm hài cốt tử sĩ Việt Nam.
After the war, I spent about a year to be part of unit that is searching for the bodies of our soldiers.
Sau đó thì tôi về giải ngũ và trở về Hà Nội.
Then I resigned from the army and returned to Hanoi.
Và học đại học trong 5 năm.
Then I went to college for 5 years.
Nhưng mà tôi học không được giỏi lắm.
I was not a very good student.
Do học dốt sinh vật, tôi trở thành nhà văn.
So because that I was so poor in biology, I becomes a writer.
Kiếm sống bằng nghề văn và nghề báo.
And make a living by writing and by being a journalist.
Nhưng sự thật thì tôi viết văn cũng rất muộn.
I start writing very late in my life.
Tức là phải đến năm 1987 tôi mới bắt đầu viết truyện ngắn đầu tay, tức là phải 15 năm sau chiến tranh. 10 năm.
I wrote my first short story in 1987. That is about 12 years after the war.
Và đến năm 88 thì tôi bắt đầu viết cuốn tiểu thuyết đầu tiên.
Starting to write my first novel in 1988.
Và bây giờ sau 10 năm thì tôi cũng bắt đầu trở thành một anh nhà văn già.
And after 10 years, I finally become an old writer.
What should we teach children in Vietnam about the American War?
Đấy là cái câu hỏi nó rất lớn, mà dạy cho con cháu như thế nào thì có lẽ là một vấn đề rất lớn mà ta không thể nói ngắn được. Tôi chỉ có thể nói là tôi dạy con tôi như thế nào.
It's rather a very, very difficult question. It's difficult to cover all the aspects of it in a short answer. I think the best thing for me is to tell you how I teach my own children.
Năm nay là con trai tôi đã bằng tuổi tôi hồi tôi nhập ngũ, nó năm 17 tuổi.
This year, my son has reached the same age when I joined the army, that is 17 years old.
Tôi nghĩ là dạy cho con cái mình trước tiên là tình yêu hòa bình. Mà muốn có được cái tình yêu hòa bình ấy thì trước tiên là phải yêu quý con người.
I think the first thing to do is to teach our son that they should love peace. And in order to love peace, they have to care for people.
Nhưng mà yêu hòa bình, yêu con người, một cách nói nó rất chung. Có lẽ ta phải nói là cái tình yêu gia đình, tình yêu cái thành phố của mình và đất nước của mình.
But to say that caring for people is something that is just too generic. I think we have to be more specific. It involves basically love your own family, love the place you live, your village, your city, and love of your land.
Và cái thời đại này là thời đại mà có thể nói chúng tôi vẫn nói đùa một thời đại của một cuộc thế chiến 4 về môi trường.
And also I believe that we are now living in an age that there is a world war, that is a world war against the environment.
Cho nên là phải yêu quý con người và yêu quý thiên nhiên.
And so not only we have to love people, but also we have to love nature.
Spec 4 Anthony Gene Harness, Kyla, Montana, U.S. Army, killed, South Vietnam, March 29th, 1969.
Jack Marvin Baker is in the Americal Division, Vietnam.
E6 Robert Raymond Brown, Special Forces.
Richard D. Applehans from Dodson, Montana. Missing in action since October 16, 1967.
Richard Betts Jr., Kalispell, Montana. Lieutenant Commander Michael Bouchard, missing in action December 20th, 1968.
Specialist 4, Clarence Frank Bristol.
First Lieutenant Richard Hurl Stoop.
First Lieutenant James Al Burns from Billings, Montana, husband. Chief Warrant Officer Manfred Cleve of Whitefish, Montana. Helicopter pilot was killed in Da Nang. First Montanan killed.
Lance Corporal Mitchell Anderson, died 20 July 1965.
My brother Larry Earl Barker, Spec 4.
Herman John Bear, Marine Corps. Stephen L. Byington, killed in action, Spec 4.
Staff Sergeant George Roll Anderson from Helena, Montana, died in Vietnam, October 6, 1968.
David Hampton Dunn, Missoula, Montana. Major Robert Carroll, Missoula, Montana, died May 12, 1968.
Edward Anthony Crothers, Marine Corps, Butte, Montana.
Dan Berry, Hardin, Montana.
Robert Vertis Tillotson, July 10, 1968. Nam, Betty Tillotson. Michael Edward Steyer from Wolf Point, Lieutenant Colonel, killed on his second tour, coming home.
Sergeant Carl Muncie, died March 30th, 66.